Hi, my name is Jonathan Roven, and today I'm going to be discussing the top 10 ways that your employer probably owes you money. First violation we'll be discussing is a meal break. When a person works a shift of at least 6 hours, they need to be given a 30-minute uninterrupted meal break before the 5th hour. That means that a person cannot be interrupted. They must be free to leave the premises, and they must be relieved of all duties. So a common violation occurs when a person is on their meal break and the boss comes in and asks a question about work, shoots them a text about work, tries to call them, tries to say you need to have your lunch breaks right here. Then if that occurs, then the employee is entitled to an hour's worth of pay, even though the interruption was just very brief. That's a very common way that employers may owe the employee money. So for every day that you did not get a proper 30-minute uninterrupted meal break, your employer owes you an extra hour's worth of pay for each of those days. If an employee is working a shift of 10 hours, then they are entitled to a second meal break. So if the employer gives the employee a first meal break, but neglects to relieve the employee of all duties for a second 30-minute uninterrupted meal break, then they are entitled to a penalty for that second meal break during that day. However, a person is only eligible for one penalty per day for meal break violations. So if there's 2 meal break violations, they can only assert a penalty for 1 hour's worth of pay. The second violation we'll be discussing are rest breaks. When a person is working of a shift of at least 4 hours, they're entitled to a 10-minute uninterrupted rest break. These rest breaks need to be paid. A person must be relieved of all duties for those 10 minutes. So a common violation once again occurs when a boss comes in and interrupts the person during their rest break and says, hey, can you hurry up with your rest break? We have customers coming in, etc. That person is now entitled to a penalty of 1 hour for the interruption of the rest break. And even though a person gets perhaps 2 or more rest breaks every work shift, they are only entitled to 1 penalty per day. Now, what happens if an employer neglects to give you both a meal break and a rest break in the same workday? You get 2 hours worth of penalties, one for the meal break violation and one for the rest break violation. So this can add up very significantly, very quickly. The third violation we'll be discussing is overtime. A person works overtime if they work over 8 hours per day or 40 hours per week. There's a difference between exempt and non-exempt employees. However, not all people who the employer claims to be exempt are actually exempt. It depends on what the employee is actually doing most of the time. So if an employee is doing administrative work or managing other employees for over half their time, then they may qualify as an exempt employee, as long as they're making at least double minimum wage. However, what happens many times is that a person will be on salary. However, they will be spending most of their time serving customers, stocking shelves, and not really doing managerial tasks or administrative tasks. That means that they would be eligible for overtime. Both salaried and hourly workers are entitled to overtime. That's a very important point because it's a common misconception. Only those salaried workers that truly qualify as exempt to overtime would not be entitled. But if they are not being paid adequately or they are not truly exempt, even salaried workers are entitled to overtime pay. Very commonly, a business will try to misclassify employees to not pay them adequately. So they will classify them as an independent contractor rather than an employee. It's a rather complicated test to determine whether or not a person is an independent contractor. However, here are a few things that you can ask to see whether your employer, who has been classifying you as an independent contractor, is incorrect. First of all, do you have your own business? Do you have your own customers where you serve them the same services as you are for this business? Do you have your own tools, or does this business supply you with the tools? Do you have a supervisor at the business, or is your work that you do for the business usually done by a specialist? In many cases, people who suspect that they are not independent contractors, are usually correct. Many times, an employer will encourage an employee to work off the clock. Ways that an employer will do this is they will give the employee too much work to do during the day. So the employee is encouraged to go and bring their work home with them or do a little bit of work before clocking in. That's what the employer's hope is, so that they don't have to pay you extra wages, especially overtime, because that could be costly for a business. If an employer sometimes asks an employee to run certain errands before work or to finish up a project by a certain deadline, requiring the employee to work at home in order to finish the task, the employee is entitled to all the hours that they were working, despite it being off the clock. Another common violation is a failure to reimburse for business expenses. So for many remote workers, they are paying for their own cell phones and their own internet. If they're conducting work-related tasks, then they should be entitled to some sort of reimbursement for their internet and their cell phone. If they are required to make certain trips to offices or pick up certain items for the business, then the employer should reimburse for both the mileage and for whatever items that were purchased. One that you might not realize is that if your employer gives you an inaccurate pay stub, you are entitled to a penalty for that pay stub. So for example, if you've been working off the clock, if you've been working through lunches, then very likely your pay stub will not have the accurate number of hours or wages that you are due. If the pay stub does not have all of those items accurately, then the employer needs to pay you a penalty of $50 for the first violation and $100 for each subsequent violation, up to a maximum of $4,000 for every inaccurate pay stub that they have provided to you. What employers often do is that they terminate an employee and not pay them right away. However, an employee is entitled to payment on the spot the same day that they have been terminated. If an employee quits, then the employer has to pay them within 72 hours of that resignation. Otherwise, the employee is entitled to a day's worth of pay for each day they have to wait, up until 30 days. So they may be entitled to an entire month's worth of work if the employer does not give the employee their final pay. If you're working in a business that you are entitled to tips, the employers, they cannot take the tips for themselves. The tips must be left for the employee that it was intended for, and the tips cannot be used to offset any sort of wages. Although tip pooling is allowed, there are certain requirements that must be met in order for it to be a legitimate tip pool. An employer may owe you money if you have been wrongfully terminated. Even though you may be an at-will employee and can be fired for any reason, it's any reason that's not against public policy. So for example, if you made recent complaints that your employer is not paying people correctly or engaging in illegal activities, or the work environment is unsafe, things of that nature, they cannot terminate you in retaliation for bringing up those types of situations. Also, your employer cannot terminate you based on any complaints about race, gender, ethnicity, any requests for a reasonable accommodation if you have a disability, and they cannot terminate you if you make a complaint about any harassment, discrimination, or retaliation. If you are wrongfully terminated, you may be entitled to the lost earnings that you would have made had you not been wrongfully terminated for any pain and suffering that you endured as a result of the termination. I hope you found this video informational and educational. Please check out my other videos in regard to other legal topics. Please share this video with your coworkers and your family and friends. In these tough economic times, employees need every dollar that they can get in which they are entitled to. For even more information, contact a knowledgeable employment attorney. If you don't have one, feel free to call my office. We'll leave the number at the bottom. And please click the subscribe button so that you'll be notified of videos in the future.